The only other thing I believe is yes, the only other element that we'll have to deal with in the game is the Huds, or the well, I call them Huds. The labels, the counters, and the things that you have are a score counter, a high score counter, and then you have an indicator for how many ships you have left or lives, and how many mines you have left. So these are very simple Huds. It's a very elegant layout. It doesn't have anything else on the screen for the standard Windows version and the Xbox version. So lastly, because this is actually quite an intense game, we're going to have to deal with some optimizations. And so some of the optimizations that I am entertaining are caching, and two kinds of caching. Caching the results of heavy calculations. So some calculations, for example, the length of a vector or calculating a vector from an angle are costly, and you don't want to do those 5,000 times per frame. What you would like to do is calculate them once and then just reuse the values over and over. Sergey's asked a question, and I'll answer back in a minute. And the other kind of caching is, and I don't normally do this, but I've seen people talk about it a lot in the forums, so I will test it both ways and see if there's any benefit. Because we're producing a lot of objects that are going to be similar, one thing we could do is simply not destroy those objects when we're done using them, but cache them, put them somewhere off screen, and then when we need a new rectangle, for example, simply look in our bucket of rectangles and see if we have one we haven't used, and bring it back to where we need it, recolor it the way we need it, resize it the way we need it, and display it. And so this is object caching. Now, personally, I don't think this is going to buy us anything. Normally, people do object. Yeah, so it's a pool. Stephen is right. It's an object pool. This for people who are watching the group chat. And the problem here that we're trying to solve when you cache an object is there's a cost to creating an object. Now, part of the cost of creating an object is memory allocation. Now, I may be misspeaking here, but in my experience, the major cost nowadays for modern computing is actually in the memory allocation. It's not in the other operations that go on once the object has been allocated. So, to be clear, you create a rectangle on the screen with an image in it. There are several steps here. One of the first steps is the game engine or the SDK needs to say, hey, operating system, I need some memory to store this information in. Give me the memory that I need. Now, the next step then would be to, let's say, tell that image, here's the buffer you're pointing to, here's the position, here's your alpha, etc., etc. The thing is memory allocation, depending on how it's handled, like I said, is very costly for CPUs today. Whereas all these operations, just changing little details in memory, are extremely quick. Memory access is slow. In the CPU and in the cache, very fast. So, backing up, when people say that they want to use pooling or a object pool, what they're doing is they're trying to amortize the cost of allocation. Do the allocation once, keep that thing in memory forever, and then just move it into view when you need it, and do those rapid operations like changing the position, changing the alpha, etc., etc. The thing is Corona SDK uses Lua to do its memory allocation, I believe. And on top of that, regardless, it uses a pooling mechanism already to allocate memory. So it grabs a block of memory and then starts to use that memory as it goes along. And then when it needs more, it grabs another block. It doesn't say, give me a little tiny segment, give me a little tiny segment. It says, give me a large block of memory, and then I will manage it myself. So the question that exists is the way that Lua/Corona is managing its own memory faster than me caching? If me caching an object is slower, then there's no point in doing it, because I use a lot of memory that I may not need, and I'm not getting any benefit out of it. So I will experiment both ways, and I will give some benchmark results that I'll show to people, and we'll decide together, both on desktop and on mobile, because it may be different on mobile, if it's worth doing this. And I'm waving at the screen like I usually do, but you can't see me. So some of the other things that we'll talk about, perhaps, if we have time and if we feel like it's really worth it, is remapping inputs, which is basically modifying the inputs on the controller, although I really don't see that being useful because we really need joysticks, and the only thing we could remap would be the button, perhaps, for laying the mines, and if we use buttons for something else. Particle alternatives. If we cannot solve the particle problem, which is when we need to get thousands and thousands of particles on the screen, we may run into a problem where we simply can't get a performant result, especially on mobile. Having thousands and thousands of objects that all need to be moving and changing their color and their alpha and dealing with collisions and all that, it may be too much for mobile. So we may need to come up with an alternative approach. So once we get there, if we decide we need to come up with an alternative approach, I will provide one, and we'll talk about that. And then lastly, grid perturbation. I think at the very least we should cover a single ripple in the grid, and then if we can find a way to do multiple ripples, all the better. So this document that I've been talking to, kind of boringly I think, is going to be available in the download link for today's show, and at the very end of it you'll be able to find some links to the MobyGame listing, a wiki that talks about the game, and I'm pointing directly at the enemies link, but you can click this and then start over and read it from the beginning. And then a YouTube video, which if you don't want to buy the game or you can't find it somewhere to play it, then you can at least watch it, and I think it's a very good example of everything we've talked about.
So Ed, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm looking here on my phone, and I see Geometry Wars 3.
Yes.
Is that the same thing?
It's the same series. I should have mentioned that. Okay, so the Geometry Wars series, I think there's somewhere between 3 and 5 games. It really depends on how you count them. It all started with Geometry Wars Retro, which then became Geometry Wars Retro Evolved, which was the first one, I think, that was released on Xbox, and then later got released on Windows. And then there was Geometry Wars Retro Evolved 2, and then Geometry Wars 3, and there may be others. So yes, all part of the same family, but Geometry Wars 3, the one you're seeing, is played on a different world style. It's got a 3D-ish implementation. Yeah. You play around a pseudosphere. I did not want to address that one because it was way beyond what I wanted to try to code up for this.
Okay. So just for people who are looking at that, especially if you're looking at it on your iOS device, I mean it's it's a $10, that's a $9.99 app from Activision.
That's a no-nonsense app.
Yeah, and that's the Geometry Wars 3 Dimensions Evolved, so which is different than what you've been describing.
Yeah, no, you can get what I've been talking about, like for $3 on Steam.
Okay.
Something like that. I think it's pretty cheap. Or wait for a sale. It goes on sale pretty often. Okay. So